Fear isn't a weakness. It's a language your body speaks fluently, even when your mind refuses to listen. Deep in the architecture of your brain, a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala processes threat faster than conscious thought can form. It evaluates silence, darkness, and isolation not as abstract concepts, but as environmental data with survival implications. When you enter a quiet place, your nervous system doesn't relax, it scans. The absence of sound creates a sensory vacuum, and evolution has taught us that predators hunt in silence, that danger announces itself through the absence of normal noise, not its presence. Your ancestors who ignored the quiet didn't pass on their genes. The ones who felt their pulse quicken in empty spaces, who experienced that primitive unease in abandoned buildings or dense forests at dusk, they survived. What you're feeling in quiet places isn't irrational. It's the echo of 1,000,000 years of successful survival strategy coded into your DNA. The question isn't why quiet places disturb us. The question is what they're still trying to tell us. Fact 1. The hallucination threshold. Absolute silence triggers auditory hallucinations in neurologically healthy adults within 30 to 45 minutes of exposure. The brain's auditory cortex, starved of external input, begins generating phantom sounds, whispers, footsteps, music, voices calling your name. This phenomenon occurs because the human auditory system evolved in environments where complete silence was a biological impossibility and often a warning sign. When deprived of the constant low-level environmental noise it expects, wind, distant water, insect sounds, the rustle of vegetation, the brain interprets this absence as a malfunction and attempts to correct it by creating its own input. These aren't vague impressions but fully formed auditory experiences that the conscious mind struggles to dismiss as unreal. The evolutionary logic is clear. In nature, total silence often preceded ambush by predators or indicated a hidden threat that had caused all other animals to freeze. Fact 2. The pressure of nothing. Microsoft's anechoic chamber in Redmond, Washington achieves negative 20.6 decibels, a measurement so far below the threshold of human hearing that it enters theoretical territory. The room absorbs 99.99% of sound through fiberglass wedges that line every surface, creating a void so complete that the ambient pressure changes become perceptible to human ears. Visitors report hearing their own eyeballs moving in their sockets, the grinding of jaw muscles, the wet click of swallowing. The longest anyone has endured inside is 45 minutes, and most participants begin exhibiting signs of acute psychological distress within half that time. The human body, it turns out, was never designed to exist in true silence. We require acoustic feedback to maintain spatial orientation, emotional regulation, and basic cognitive function. Fact 3. The dead room effect. Anechoic chambers cause immediate and measurable changes to blood pressure, heart rate variability, and cortisol production. Within minutes of entering these spaces, the body's stress response activates as if responding to genuine environmental threat. The vestibular system, which relies partially on acoustic reflection to help maintain balance, begins to fail. People lose their sense of up and down. They stumble. They reach for walls that their eyes can see but their bodies can't locate in space. The technical term for this is acoustic proprioception, the way we use sound, even unconsciously, to understand where we are. Remove that sense entirely, and the human animal becomes functionally disabled. The implications extend beyond laboratory curiosities. They suggest that silence itself is a form of sensory deprivation severe enough to qualify as a stressor. Fact 4. The frequency of fear. Infrasound, acoustic waves below 20 Hz, beneath the range of human hearing, induces feelings of dread, anxiety, and supernatural presence. Quiet places often aren't silent at all. They're filled with sounds our conscious minds can't detect but our bodies absolutely can. Wind moving through valleys, distant traffic, geological settling, HVAC systems. All these produce infrasonic frequencies that trigger the same neural pathways as genuine threats. The eye vibrates at 18 Hz. When infrasound at or near this frequency enters the body, it can cause visual distortions, shadows in peripheral vision, the sensation of movement where none exists. Researchers believe many reported ghost sightings occur in buildings where structural resonance produces these exact frequencies. The presence people feel in empty rooms isn't supernatural. It's mechanical vibration interpreted by evolutionary hardware designed to detect predators you can't quite see. Fact 5. The silence before. Emergency dispatchers can identify the severity of a crisis by measuring the background silence in a caller's location. When someone calls from a genuinely dangerous situation, ambient environmental noise drops measurably, not because the environment changes, but because the human auditory system, flooded with adrenaline, suppresses processing of irrelevant sound. This creates a documented phenomenon called threat-induced auditory narrowing. The person in danger isn't hearing the normal sounds around them anymore. Their brain has filtered out everything except potential threat signals. Dispatchers trained to recognize this pattern describe it as a quality of emptiness in the call, a hollowness that indicates the caller's perceptual reality has already shifted into survival mode. The quiet isn't in the room. It's in the listener's narrowing world. Fact 6. The architecture of unease asterisk. Prisons, hospitals, and institutional buildings constructed before 1970 share acoustic properties that measurably increase psychological distress. Long corridors with hard reflective surfaces create standing waves, sound that bounces back and forth without dissipating, building in intensity. Footsteps echo with unnatural clarity. Voices carry in ways that make distance impossible to judge. The brain, receiving conflicting spatial information, enters a state of low-level but constant alertness. Studies of prison violence show statistically significant increases in assaults in cell blocks with these acoustic characteristics compared to facilities designed with sound-absorbing materials. The architecture doesn't just house violence, it generates the neurological conditions that make violence more likely. Silence in these spaces isn't peaceful, it's pressurized. Fact 7. The void between words. The average human conversation contains micro-pauses of 200 to 300 milliseconds between speaking turns. When these pauses extend beyond 1 full second, measurable psychological discomfort occurs in both participants. The listener's anterior cingulate cortex, the brain region associated with error detection and conflict monitoring, activates as if something has gone wrong. Silence in social contexts reads as malfunction, not peace. This creates a documented phenomenon in interrogation psychology. Detainees will often begin speaking simply to fill an extended silence, even when remaining quiet would serve their legal interests better. The discomfort of silence between humans is so acute that it overrides rational self-interest. We are so fundamentally social that we'll sabotage ourselves rather than endure another person's quiet. Fact 8. The absence pattern. Sound masking, the deliberate introduction of low-level noise into quiet environments, improves cognitive performance, emotional regulation, and even physical healing rates in hospital patients. Complete silence, counterintuitively, impairs concentration. The brain allocates processing resources to scanning for threats in unnaturally quiet environments, resources that would otherwise be available for focus and memory formation. Open-plan offices that installed sound masking systems showed documented improvements in worker productivity and decreases in reported stress levels, not because the added noise was pleasant, but because it provided the acoustic baseline the human nervous system expects. We don't think better in silence. We think better when our threat detection systems can relax, and they only relax when the environmental acoustic profile matches evolutionary expectations. Fact 9. The tinnitus threshold. Prolonged exposure to near silence can trigger or worsen tinnitus, the perception of sound when no external sound exists. The auditory nerve, lacking external input, increases its own sensitivity to compensate, eventually amplifying its own background electrical activity into perceived sound. This isn't damage in the traditional sense, it's neuroplasticity gone wrong. The brain, attempting to adapt to an environment it wasn't designed for, adapts itself into malfunction. Roughly 15% of adults experience chronic tinnitus, and prevalence increases among people who work in unusually quiet environments: librarians, night security guards, remote researchers. The silence doesn't just reveal the ringing, it causes it. Fact 10. The soundproof confession. Soundproofed interrogation rooms increase false confession rates in measurable ways. When environmental sound is eliminated, suspects lose temporal reference points: the passing traffic, the air conditioning cycling, the distant voices that unconsciously mark the passage of time. Hours compress or expand. The present moment becomes untethered from normal duration. Cognitive psychologists call this temporal disintegration, and it's one of the primary mechanisms through which exhaustion breaks down resistance. The quiet doesn't just isolate, it distorts the experience of time itself, creating a psychological environment where the suspect's sense of how long they've endured questioning becomes unreliable. They'll sign confessions not just to end the questioning, but because their perception of how long they can continue to endure has been fundamentally compromised. Fact 11. The library paradox. Libraries rank among the most psychologically stressful public environments, despite their association with calm and learning. The enforced quiet creates hypervigilance. Every cough, every chair scrape, every page turn becomes amplified into potential disruption. Cortisol measurements taken from library patrons show elevations consistent with low-grade chronic stress, sustained over hours. The whispered quality of permitted speech activates threat assessment pathways because whispers, in evolutionary terms, signal danger or conspiracy. We whisper to avoid detection by threats, or we whisper when planning actions that require secrecy. A building full of whispers is a building that tells your amygdala something is wrong. The irony is profound. Spaces designed for contemplative focus create neurological conditions that impair focus. Fact 12. The acoustic shadow asterisk. Certain geographic formations create acoustic shadows, zones where sound propagation is measurably reduced by terrain. Valleys positioned perpendicular to prevailing winds, areas surrounded by specific rock formations, forests with particular species compositions of trees. These locations create natural sound dampening that can reduce ambient noise by 30 to 40 decibels. Indigenous cultures worldwide have recognized these locations and consistently associated them with spiritual significance or danger. The Navajo have documented silent places they traditionally avoided. Aboriginal Australians marked certain valleys as sites where the ancestors fell silent. These aren't superstitions. They're culturally transmitted knowledge about locations where the normal acoustic environment is disrupted in ways that trigger human unease. Fact 13. The isolation tank descent. Sensory deprivation tanks eliminate sound along with light, touch, temperature variation, and gravitational stress. Within 2 hours, the brain's default mode network, the system active during rest and introspection, begins to behave abnormally. Users report vivid hallucinations, out-of-body experiences, encounters with presences or entities, and temporary dissolution of the sense of self as a coherent entity separate from the environment. These aren't mystical experiences. They're predictable neurological responses to an environment the human brain has no evolutionary framework for processing. The self, it turns out, requires constant sensory input to maintain its boundaries. Remove that input, and the distinction between you and not you begins to dissolve. The quiet doesn't reveal your true self. It erases the mechanisms that generate the experience of having a self at all. Fact 14. The concrete resonance asterisk. Underground parking structures produce infrasound through a mechanism called cavity resonance. When wind passes over ventilation openings, It creates pressure fluctuations inside the structure that generate frequencies between 4 and 16 Hz. These frequencies cause documented increases in heart rate, respiratory rate, and reported feelings of being watched or followed. Security footage analysis from parking structures shows behavioral changes consistent with anxiety. People walk faster, check over their shoulders more frequently, and cluster near exits. The feeling of threat in underground parking isn't cultural conditioning from crime dramas. It's a physiological response to acoustic properties that indicate enclosed spaces with limited escape routes, exactly the kind of environment that was lethal to our ancestors. Fact 15. The snow silence. Fresh snowfall absorbs sound with extraordinary efficiency, creating temporary acoustic dead zones. Snow's porous structure traps and dissipates sound waves, reducing ambient noise by up to 60%. People consistently report feelings of unreality, disconnection, and mild anxiety during and immediately after heavy snowfall, particularly in urban environments where baseline noise is normally high. The brain, receiving a dramatically altered acoustic profile of a familiar environment, struggles to reconcile the visual information. This is the same street, with the acoustic information. This environment is unfamiliar. The resulting cognitive dissonance manifests as a vague sense of wrongness. The world looks right but sounds wrong, and that mismatch activates the same neural pathways as genuine environmental hazards. Fact 16. The abandoned building frequency asterisk. Structures without human habitation develop characteristic acoustic signatures as they decay. Windows break, creating new pathways for wind. Materials contract and expand. Small animals move through walls. These sounds occur at irregular intervals that prevent habituation, the process by which the brain learns to ignore consistent background noise. Random acoustic events in abandoned buildings keep the nervous system in a state of sustained alertness, because pattern recognition systems can't predict when the next sound will occur. Predictable sounds become invisible to consciousness. Unpredictable sounds remain salient, potentially threatening, worthy of continued attention. An abandoned building isn't just quiet. It's filled with sounds specifically structured to prevent your threat detection systems from standing down. Fact 17. The white noise dependency. Extended use of white noise machines creates measurable changes in auditory processing. The brain, continuously exposed to uniform sound across all frequencies, recalibrates its threshold for what constitutes silence. People who sleep with white noise for months or years experience increasing difficulty sleeping in naturally quiet environments. The brain has restructured its baseline expectations. What was once peaceful quiet now registers as too silent, potentially threatening, worthy of arousal and investigation. This dependency isn't psychological in the casual sense. It's neuroplastic change. The physical structure and function of auditory processing pathways has adapted to an artificial acoustic environment and lost some capacity to function in the natural one. Fact 18. The nocturnal amplification. Auditory sensitivity increases by approximately 25% during nighttime hours, even in subjects who aren't trying to sleep. This circadian variation in hearing threshold is an evolutionary adaptation to increased predation risk during darkness. The same sound that barely registers during daylight hours becomes intrusive and attention-capturing at night. Quiet places aren't quieter at night. They just seem that way because your hearing has temporarily become more acute. Every small sound is amplified. The settling of structures, the movement of pipes, the activities of nocturnal animals, all these move from imperceptible background noise to conscious awareness. The night isn't louder. You're just biologically primed to hear threats that hunt in darkness. Fact 19. The monastic silence studies. Longitudinal research on monastic communities that practice extended silence reveals measurable neurological changes. Brain imaging shows decreased activity in language centers and corresponding increases in regions associated with visual and spatial processing. Speech production areas show physical changes in neural density after years of minimal verbal communication. These aren't deficits. Cognitive testing shows maintained or improved function in most domains, but they demonstrate that the human brain physically reconfigures itself in response to sustained quiet. Monks who have observed silence for decades process social information differently than controls. They show reduced activation in regions that typically process speech-related threats or challenges. The silence doesn't just become comfortable. It restructures the neural architecture that generates discomfort. Fact 20. The acoustic uncanny valley. Audio recordings of quiet places sound fundamentally different from actually being in those places, even when played back at high fidelity. The human auditory system uses microscopic time differences between when sound reaches each ear to construct spatial information. Recordings collapse this three-dimensional acoustic information into two channels, creating what audio engineers call a flat soundscape. Listeners report that recordings of quiet spaces sound wrong or off, even when they can't articulate what's missing. The wrongness triggers unease because the brain receives conflicting information, the characteristics of a quiet space without the spatial coherence that should accompany it. It's not quite real and not quite fake, existing in an acoustic uncanny valley that generates the same discomfort as almost but not quite human faces. Fact 21. The deep cave silence. Caves beyond the reach of surface sound create the closest approximation to absolute silence found in natural environments. Research subjects placed in deep cave chambers report intense anxiety, hallucinations, and rapid onset of temporal disorientation within 30 minutes. The complete absence of the Earth's normal acoustic baseline, wind, water, animal sounds, removes every environmental cue the brain uses to maintain temporal continuity. Minutes feel like hours. Hours compress into minutes. The sense of duration becomes completely unreliable. Cavers describe this as time sickness, a disorientation so profound that it resembles the early stages of altitude sickness or decompression illness. The silence isn't just quiet. It's the absence of the rhythms that allow human consciousness to track its own existence through time. Fact 22. The forest hush. Old-growth forests create zones of profound quiet through a mechanism called acoustic filtering. Multiple canopy layers, dense understory vegetation, and thick leaf litter absorb sound frequencies selectively, removing high-frequency sounds while allowing low frequencies to propagate. The result is an environment where human voices sound muffled and deadened, but the rumble of distant thunder or the growl of large predators carries clearly. This acoustic profile matches precisely the threat environment human ancestors faced. Close-range communication is difficult, but the sounds of actual danger remain audible. The unease people report in quiet sections of old-growth forest isn't random. It's a response to an acoustic environment that tells your threat detection systems that you're in predator territory. Fact 23. The suburban silence paradox. Suburban neighborhoods designed for quiet generate higher rates of reported anxiety and depression than urban areas with higher ambient noise. The isolation isn't just social, it's acoustic. Suburban sound environments lack the constant low-level human activity, sounds that signal proximity to potential help. In evolutionary terms, silence in the presence of other humans is abnormal. It suggests either danger that has caused others to hide, or isolation that leaves you vulnerable. Modern suburban design creates exactly this environment. You know other people are nearby, but you can't hear them. The resulting mismatch between visual information and acoustic information creates sustained low-grade stress. You see a safe environment but hear an empty one, and your nervous system trusts the acoustic information more. Fact 24. The wind absence. Regions where wind is consistently absent create documented psychological effects in long-term residents. The inner ear's vestibular system uses tiny movements caused by air pressure fluctuation to help maintain balance and spatial orientation. In areas with no wind, deep valleys, certain equatorial zones, some urban environments blocked by buildings, this subtle input disappears. Long-term residents report increased rates of vertigo, balance problems, and a sensation described as feeling untethered or floating. The wind isn't just weather. It's a constant source of proprioceptive information that helps anchor you in physical space. Remove it, and the sense of being firmly connected to the ground gradually degrades. Fact 25. The digital silence. Noise-canceling headphones create an artificial silence that differs fundamentally from natural quiet. They work by generating inverse sound waves that cancel ambient noise, but the process isn't perfect. The result is a sound environment where certain frequencies are eliminated while others pass through, creating what audio engineers call spectral holes. The brain receives an impossible acoustic profile, some frequencies absent, others present, in combinations that never occur naturally. Extended use generates complaints of pressure in the ears, headaches, and anxiety that users struggle to attribute to any specific cause. The silence isn't restful because it's not real silence. It's an artificial acoustic environment that your perceptual systems can't properly process. Fact 26. The isolation ward effect. Hospital isolation rooms designed for infectious disease control create severe psychological stress through acoustic isolation. Thick walls, sealed doors, and positive or negative pressure systems eliminate most environmental sound. Patients in isolation report time distortion, auditory hallucinations, and acute anxiety at rates significantly higher than patients in standard rooms with identical medical severity. The medical isolation is necessary, but it creates an environment the human nervous system interprets as abandonment. Nursing protocols now require regular unnecessary visits to isolation patients specifically to provide acoustic evidence of nearby human presence. The sounds of care, voices, footsteps, doors opening, aren't just comfort. They're necessary sensory input to maintain psychological stability. Fact 27. The tunnel resonance. Underground tunnels create standing waves at specific frequencies determined by their dimensions. A tunnel's length, width, and height create a resonant cavity that amplifies certain sounds while dampening others. Transit tunnels, mining tunnels, and utility tunnels all produce characteristic acoustic profiles that include significant infrasound components. Workers in tunnel environments report higher rates of anxiety, paranoia, and reported supernatural experiences than workers in equivalent surface jobs. The correlation holds across cultures and historical periods. Roman mine workers left inscriptions describing presences in deep tunnels. Modern subway workers report identical experiences. The presence isn't supernatural. It's your body responding to acoustic frequencies that indicate you're in an enclosed underground space with limited escape routes. Fact 28. The sacred silence. Religious buildings across cultures share acoustic properties that enhance the psychological impact of silence. High ceilings, stone surfaces, and specific dimensional ratios create reverberation times between 2 and 4 seconds, long enough to make speech seem otherworldly, short enough to remain intelligible. When hundreds of people sit in silence in these spaces, the collective breathing, small movements, and biological sounds create a low-frequency acoustic pattern that resembles natural sounds like wind or distant water. This isn't accidental. These buildings were designed through trial and error over centuries to create acoustic environments that reliably produce specific psychological states. The silence in sacred spaces isn't just the absence of speech. It's a carefully engineered acoustic environment designed to alter consciousness. Fact 29. The night shift deterioration asterisk. Workers on permanent night shifts in quiet facilities, security guards, archivists, overnight hospital staff, show measurable cognitive decline that doesn't occur in equally quiet daytime environments or noisy nighttime environments. The combination of nighttime and quiet specifically impairs memory formation, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Sleep research suggests this occurs because quiet nighttime environments fail to provide the sensory stimulation necessary to maintain alertness, while simultaneously activating ancient threat detection responses to being awake and isolated during darkness. The brain receives contradictory signals. You should be asleep, but you're awake, and the environment is threatening, but you're supposed to work. This conflict generates stress hormones that impair cognitive function over time. Fact 30. The audience silence. The silence of an audience differs acoustically and psychologically from the silence of an empty room. Hundreds of people actively suppressing movement and sound create a distinctive acoustic signature: controlled breathing. Occasional swallows, the rustle of clothing during tiny, unavoidable movements. Performers describe this silence as pressure or weight, and acoustic measurements confirm that audience silence contains more low-frequency energy than empty room silence. The silence isn't empty. It's filled with the sounds of collective restraint. For performers, this silence reads as focused attention, which can be supportive or threatening depending on context. For audience members, maintaining silence requires continuous active inhibition, generating measurable increases in stress hormones over the course of a performance. Fact 31. The refrigerator hum baseline. Modern residential environments maintain a constant acoustic baseline around 40 decibels from appliances, HVAC systems, and electrical infrastructure. When these sounds cease, during power outages, residents report immediate discomfort and anxiety, even before they've consciously noticed the power failure. The brain detects the change in ambient sound before conscious awareness registers it. This instant recognition occurs because the refrigerator hum, the HVAC cycling, and the electrical buzz have become part of the expected acoustic environment. Their absence is abnormal, therefore potentially dangerous. People don't miss the sounds because they like them. They miss them because their nervous systems have incorporated them into the definition of a safe environment. Fact 32. The waiting room design. Medical waiting rooms are acoustically engineered to prevent private conversations while maintaining a quiet atmosphere. Sound masking systems, specific ceiling heights, and surface materials create an environment where conversations at normal volume are unintelligible beyond 10 to 15 feet. This privacy protection, however, creates psychological stress. People can hear that others are speaking but can't understand the content, creating what acoustic researchers call the cocktail party effect. The brain expends significant cognitive resources attempting to extract meaning from partially audible speech. Extended exposure to this acoustic environment generates measurable increases in cortisol and subjective reports of exhaustion. The waiting room isn't just boring. It's acoustically structured in ways that generate mental fatigue. Fact 33. The snow machine uncanny asterisk. Artificial snow machines used in film production create visual snow, but not acoustic snow. Real snow absorbs sound dramatically. Artificial snow made from soap, paper, or plastic creates visual realism, but leaves the acoustic environment unchanged. Film production staff and actors report that snow scenes feel wrong or off during filming in ways that don't translate to the final edited footage. The wrongness comes from the mismatch between visual information. This is a snow-covered environment, and acoustic information. This environment has normal sound propagation. The brain struggles to reconcile the conflict. The scene looks right but sounds wrong, creating sustained low-level cognitive dissonance that generates fatigue and irritability in people working on set. Fact 34. The bunker psychology. Nuclear fallout shelters and deep bunkers produce documented psychological effects within 72 hours of continuous occupancy. Time distortion, interpersonal conflict, and anxiety increase measurably compared to control groups in surface buildings. The acoustic environment contributes significantly. Bunkers lack the normal variation in environmental sound that helps track time. No traffic patterns marking morning and evening rush hours. No birds signaling dawn. No wind changes indicating weather systems. The acoustic environment is static, or changes only through HVAC cycling, which becomes predictable and therefore invisible to consciousness. Without acoustic time markers, the psychological experience of duration becomes unreliable. Days feel longer, hours compress. The timeline of events becomes confused. Fact 35. The recording studio breakdown. Professional recording studios built for maximum acoustic isolation produce psychological stress in musicians during extended sessions. The complete absence of room ambience, the subtle echoes and reflections that normally inform us about room size and shape, creates what audio engineers call dead room disorientation. Musicians report feeling disconnected from their instruments, unable to judge volume or tone accurately, and increasingly anxious as sessions extend. Experienced studio musicians develop coping strategies, but first-time performers in fully isolated studios often experience acute distress. The room doesn't just sound different, it removes the acoustic feedback that allows performers to feel connected to the physical reality of their performance. Fact 36. The midnight zone. Urban environments experience a documented midnight zone between roughly 2 and 4 a.m. where ambient sound drops below levels that normally occur at any time of day. Traffic ceases. Businesses close. HVAC systems cycle down. Even in major cities, sound levels during the midnight zone approach those of rural areas. Police reports show statistically significant increases in calls about suspicious sounds or prowlers during these hours, with most reports ultimately unfounded. The increase correlates with the acoustic environment, not actual threats. Residents are hearing normal nighttime sounds, animals, buildings settling, distant activity, but against an abnormally quiet background that makes these sounds salient and potentially threatening. The city isn't more dangerous at 3 a.m. It's just quiet enough that normal sounds trigger threat assessment. Fact 37. The anechoic tinnitus. Extended exposure to anechoic chambers temporarily worsens or induces tinnitus in approximately 70% of subjects. The auditory nerve, straining to detect sound in an environment where almost none exists, amplifies its own sensitivity to the point where it begins detecting and processing its own background electrical activity. This creates perception of sound, usually a high-pitched ringing or hissing, where no external sound exists. For most subjects, the tinnitus resolves within hours of leaving the chamber, but repeated exposures can make the effect more persistent. The implication is significant. The auditory system isn't designed to tolerate silence. Push it into an environment quiet enough, and it will create sound rather than accept the acoustic void. Fact 38. The conversation dead zone. Open-plan offices create acoustic environments that impair meaningful conversation while increasing overall noise levels. Sound travels freely, creating a constant background of unintelligible speech, keyboard noise, and movement. This forces people to raise their voices to be heard, which increases the overall noise level in a feedback loop. Paradoxically, truly quiet, focused work becomes impossible, while genuine conversation also becomes difficult because privacy no longer exists. Workers in open-plan offices report lower job satisfaction, higher stress, and measurable decreases in complex cognitive task performance. The environment isn't quiet or loud. It's stuck in an acoustic middle ground that satisfies neither the need for silence nor the need for connection. Fact 39. The basement frequency. Residential basements produce infrasound through a combination of factors: ground coupling, HVAC resonance, and water pipes. These frequencies, typically between 8 and 16 Hz, create documented feelings of unease, being watched, and presence of others. The human eyeball resonates at approximately 18 Hz. Infrasound near this frequency can cause the eyeball to vibrate slightly, creating visual distortions, movements in peripheral vision, shadows that aren't there, figures that disappear when looked at directly. These effects, combined with the cultural association of basements with danger, create a feedback loop where genuine physiological responses reinforce learned expectations. The basement isn't haunted. It's generating frequencies that cause predictable perceptual distortions. Fact 40. The visual exhaustion. Overnight vigils, whether religious, medical, or funerary, create specific patterns of cognitive impairment related to sustained quiet wakefulness. Subjects maintaining silence through the night show decreased performance on memory and attention tasks equivalent to 0.08% blood alcohol content by dawn. The impairment comes not from sleep deprivation alone, but from the combination of sleep deprivation and acoustic monotony. The brain, lacking varying sensory input to maintain alertness, begins to shut down non-essential functions. Traditions of overnight vigils exist across cultures, often with spiritual or transformative significance attributed to the experience. The altered state isn't mystical. It's predictable neurological impairment from sustained quiet darkness. Fact 41. The soundproof apartment syndrome. High-end urban apartments with advanced soundproofing create unexpected psychological problems for residents. The elimination of neighbor noise, traffic sounds, and street activity removes the acoustic evidence of nearby human presence. Residents report increased anxiety, loneliness, and difficulty sleeping despite having specifically sought out quiet living spaces. The brain interprets the acoustic isolation as genuine physical isolation, triggering stress responses despite the cognitive knowledge that hundreds of people are nearby. Residents often resort to playing artificial ambient sound, city noise recordings, crowd murmurs, traffic sounds, to recreate the acoustic environment their nervous systems expect. They paid for silence, then had to buy back noise. Fact 42. The submarine silence. Submarines maintain acoustic discipline during silent running protocols, requiring crew members to minimize all unnecessary sound. Psychological evaluations of crew members after extended silent running periods show measurable increases in anxiety, interpersonal tension, and reported paranoia. The silence creates acoustic conditions similar to isolation, even though crew members are surrounded by others. The inability to hear routine human activity, conversations, footsteps, work sounds, triggers the same neural pathways as actual social isolation. Experienced submariners report that silent running feels more psychologically demanding than combat operations, not despite, but because of the extended quiet. The threat of being heard by enemy sonar is real, but the psychological cost of silence is tangible and immediate. Fact 43. The quarry stillness asterisk. Abandoned quarries create unusual acoustic environments through their geometric properties. Steep walls, water-filled depths, and specific angles create sound reflection patterns that distort distance perception and directional hearing. Sounds appear to come from locations they don't originate from. Echoes arrive in patterns that don't match normal environmental acoustics. Quarries have disproportionately high rates of accidents and deaths, many attributed to swimmers or explorers who became disoriented. The acoustic disorientation contributes. People misjudge distances, can't locate sounds accurately, and experience spatial confusion that impairs navigation and threat assessment. The water isn't the only danger. The acoustic environment itself is hazardous. Fact 44. The night silence variation asterisk. Rural and urban night silences differ in ways that create problems for people who move between these environments. Urban residents visiting rural areas report difficulty sleeping due to the too quiet environment and the presence of unfamiliar sounds, insects, wind, animals, that become salient against the quiet background. Rural residents in cities report equivalent difficulties with the never fully quiet urban acoustic environment. The adjustment period for acoustic habituation, when moving between environments ranges from 2 weeks to several months. The nervous system has to recalibrate its baseline expectations for what constitutes safe environmental sound. During this transition period, sleep quality decreases and anxiety increases measurably. Fact 45. The concert hall silence. The silence before a performance begins differs neurologically from other silences. Audience members in this silence show elevated heart rates, increased cortisol, and activation of brain regions associated with anticipation and reward prediction. The silence isn't absence, it's potential. The acoustic environment is about to change dramatically, and the brain prepares by increasing arousal and attention. Performers report experiencing this silence as either supportive pressure or threatening demand, depending on psychological factors. The same acoustic environment, hundreds of people in enforced silence, creates opposite emotional valences depending on your role. For listeners, the silence promises reward. For performers, it promises judgment. Fact 46. The white room syndrome. Medical isolation rooms with white walls, white ceilings, and minimal acoustic absorption create measurable increases in patient anxiety and slower recovery times. The combination of visual monotony and acoustic reflection, sounds bounce off hard white surfaces creating harsh reverberations, generates an environment that impairs both psychological comfort and physical healing. Studies comparing patient outcomes in acoustically treated rooms versus standard rooms show statistically significant differences in pain medication requirements, sleep quality, and length of stay. The silence isn't the problem. The quality of the silence, harsh, reflective, dead, creates stress that manifests in measurable medical outcomes. Fact 47. The storm silence. The distinctive quiet before severe storms results from atmospheric pressure changes that affect sound propagation. Animals respond by reducing vocalizations, creating an unusual absence of normal environmental sound. Humans detect this silence and report feelings of unease and anticipation, even before conscious awareness of approaching weather. The mechanism appears to be both learned, cultural transmission of storm silence as warning, and direct physiological response to the pressure changes themselves. Barometric pressure affects inner ear function and sinus pressure, creating physical sensations that the brain associates with threat even without conscious recognition of what's changing. The silence before the storm isn't ominous through metaphor. It's a genuine environmental warning signal. Fact 48. The isolation tank time. Sensory deprivation tanks eliminate external time cues so thoroughly that subjects lose the ability to estimate duration after approximately 45 minutes. Asked to estimate how long they've been in the tank, subjects' estimates vary from half to triple the actual time elapsed. The brain's time-tracking mechanisms require external reference points, changes in light, temperature, sound, body position. Remove all these, and the internal clock becomes unreliable. The loss of temporal orientation is reported as one of the most disturbing aspects of extended tank sessions, more unsettling than hallucinations or physical sensations. Time is so fundamental to conscious experience that losing the ability to track it feels like losing contact with reality itself. Fact 49. The library whisper echo. Large libraries create acoustic environments where whispers carry further and more clearly than normal speech. The reverberant properties of large rooms with hard surfaces and the specific frequency profile of whispered speech, which emphasizes high frequencies that reflect well, combine to make whispers propagate efficiently. This creates a situation where attempting to speak quietly actually makes your speech more audible at distance than speaking at low normal volume. Library users unconsciously learn this and adjust their whisper volume upward to compensate, creating a feedback loop where whisper volume gradually increases over time. The enforced quiet becomes paradoxically louder than if normal low-volume speech were permitted. Fact 50. The Midnight Factory. Industrial facilities operating 24-hour shifts show different accident rates during night shifts, not because of worker fatigue alone, but because of acoustic environment changes. Many industrial sounds that provide unconscious safety information during day shifts, the number of other workers present, the operation of specific equipment, the approach of vehicles or machinery, become more difficult to hear against quiet night backgrounds or more prominent in the absence of day shift ambient noise. Workers report difficulty judging distances to sound sources, missing acoustic warnings they'd normally catch, and experiencing acoustic illusions about equipment status. The night shift isn't just darker, it's acoustically different in ways that increase hazard. Fact 51. The elevator silence. Enclosed elevators create obligatory silence among strangers through a combination of acoustic and social factors. The small enclosed space with reflective surfaces makes every sound, breathing, clothing rustle, swallowing, clearly audible to all occupants. This acoustic intimacy with strangers triggers discomfort that leads to silence, but the resulting quiet then amplifies every small sound into heightened salience. Elevator riders report acute self-consciousness about their own sounds and hyper-awareness of others' sounds. The average elevator ride, lasting 30 to 45 seconds, produces measurable increases in cortisol and heart rate. The silence isn't comfortable. It's an enforced quiet that amplifies the very awareness everyone is trying to suppress. Fact 52. The archive preservation. Climate-controlled archives and rare book libraries maintain environmental conditions that include strict acoustic control. The HVAC systems required for preservation create constant white noise that staff members report initially disturbing, but eventually becoming essential. Staff working in archives report difficulty sleeping in normal home environments during their first months of employment, because the absence of the archive's white noise makes homes seem too quiet. The brain adapts to the constant sound as the new baseline, and genuine quiet then seems abnormal and potentially threatening. The adaptation demonstrates neuroplasticity. The acoustic environment literally rewires what the brain recognizes as normal. Fact 53. The observation room dynamic asterisk. Police observation rooms with one-way glass create different acoustic experiences for observers and observed. The observed room often has acoustic treatment to improve recording quality, creating a deader sound than normal rooms. The observation room typically has reflective surfaces, creating different room tone. Officers watching interrogations report a sense of disconnection or unreality when switching between rooms. The acoustic mismatch. The rooms look similar but sound different, creates cognitive dissonance. The brain struggles to reconcile why two visually similar spaces have such different acoustic properties. This perceptual conflict contributes to the psychological stress of both conducting and observing interrogations. Fact 54. The canyon echo delay. Deep canyons create echo delays long enough that the brain processes them as separate sound events rather than reflections. A shout in a canyon might echo 3, 4, 5 seconds later, long enough that the auditory system treats it as a new sound rather than a reflection of the original. This creates the illusion of other presences responding to your sounds. Indigenous peoples worldwide incorporated canyon acoustics into spiritual practices, interpreting the echoes as responses from spirits or ancestors. The spiritual interpretation overlay on a physical phenomenon that genuinely feels like communication. The canyon isn't answering, but the acoustic properties create an experience that resembles conversation. Fact 55. The operating theater silence. Surgical operating rooms maintain acoustic protocols where unnecessary sound is minimized to allow clear communication of critical information. Studies of surgical teams show that the quality of silence, whether tense or relaxed, predicts surgical outcomes. Tense silence correlates with higher complication rates, not because silence causes complications, but because tense silence indicates team dysfunction or difficulty with the procedure. The silence becomes a diagnostic tool. Experienced surgical nurses report using the quality of operating room silence to assess procedure difficulty and team coordination without conscious analysis. They hear problems in the silence before explicit communication makes those problems clear. Fact 56. The apartment footstep paranoia. Residents of apartments with poor sound isolation develop acoustic hypervigilance regarding footsteps in adjacent units. The brain, hearing footsteps from above or beside, unconsciously tracks patterns, departure times, arrival times, activity levels. Changes to these patterns trigger alertness and anxiety even when the conscious mind hasn't noticed the change. Residents report feeling that something is off when neighbors change schedules, with the feeling manifesting before conscious recognition of what changed. The hypervigilance isn't paranoia. It's pattern recognition operating below conscious awareness. Your brain is tracking acoustic data and alerting you to anomalies you haven't consciously processed. Fact 57. The vocal fry quiet asterisk. Vocal fry, the low, creaky voice quality that occurs at the bottom of vocal range, carries better in quiet environments than normal speech. This creates a situation where people unconsciously adopt vocal fry in libraries, religious spaces, and other quiet environments because it allows communication at lower volumes. The vocal fry then becomes associated with these spaces, creating a cultural marker of respect or appropriate behavior. The acoustic utility came first. Vocal fry is genuinely more efficient for quiet communication, and the social meaning evolved from this functional origin. What seems like cultural behavior has acoustic physics underlying it. Fact 58. The ice silence. Extreme cold environments create acoustic properties that contribute to psychological stress in polar and high-altitude research stations. Cold air conducts sound differently than warm air, creating unusual propagation patterns. Sounds appear closer or more distant than they actually are. The absence of vegetation, water, and most animal life removes familiar acoustic references. Long-term polar researchers report increasing difficulty judging distances, locating sound sources, and maintaining normal conversation. The acoustic environment is so different from evolutionary norms that basic auditory skills become unreliable. The cold isn't just uncomfortable. It creates an alien acoustic environment that impairs fundamental perceptual abilities. Fact 59. The shared silence interpretation. Two people experiencing the same silence interpret it differently based on relationship context. Silence between intimate partners generally reduces stress markers, while silence between strangers or antagonists increases them. The acoustic environment is identical, but the social context completely changes the neurological response. Brain imaging shows different activation patterns for comfortable versus uncomfortable silence, with uncomfortable silence activating threat assessment regions and comfortable silence activating regions associated with rest and trust. The silence isn't inherently good or bad. The relationship defines whether that silence feels safe or threatening. Fact 60. The construction site silence. Construction sites that fall silent during normal working hours trigger immediate attention from site supervisors and safety personnel. The silence indicates either break time, equipment failure, or accident, and the acoustic change carries information about which. Experienced supervisors report being able to differentiate types of work stoppage by the quality of the resulting silence. Complete silence suggests everybody stopped simultaneously, an accident or emergency. Partial silence with specific equipment missing suggests mechanical failure. The silence isn't just absence of work sound. It's structured information about what caused the work to stop. The experienced ear reads silence the way others read text. Fact 61. The solitary confinement sound. Prisoners in solitary confinement develop heightened auditory sensitivity that persists after release. The brain, starved for sensory input during isolation, recalibrates to amplify any available acoustic information. Former inmates report difficulty tolerating normal environmental noise levels, experiencing standard urban sound as overwhelming and painful. The change isn't psychological adaptation, it's measurable change in auditory processing thresholds. The brain has physically restructured itself to function in acoustic deprivation, and that restructuring doesn't immediately reverse when normal acoustic environments are restored. The silence doesn't just affect you during confinement, it changes your neurology in ways that persist. Fact 62. The movie theater anticipation. The silence after lights dim, but before a film begins, creates measurable physiological arousal across audiences. Heart rates increase, breathing synchronizes across audience members, and stress hormones elevate slightly. The brain is preparing for the acoustic and visual intensity about to begin. This preparation period is psychologically distinct from other silences. It's not threatening but exciting, not empty but full of potential. Theater designers and filmmakers use this silence deliberately, understanding that the quality of silence before content begins affects the audience's engagement with that content. The silence isn't dead time. It's the runway for the experience about to launch. Fact 63. The acoustic comfort distance. Every acoustic environment has a comfort distance, the spacing at which people feel most psychologically comfortable based on how well sound carries. In quiet libraries, people maintain greater distances from strangers than in moderately noisy coffee shops, not because of personal space norms, but because quiet amplifies every sound, making closer proximity feel invasive. In very loud environments, people cluster closer together to enable communication. The acoustic environment shapes social distance more than cultural norms in many contexts. You're not responding to social rules about appropriate distance. You're responding to acoustic properties that make certain distances feel right or wrong. Fact 64. The night guard hallucination. Security guards working alone in large, quiet buildings overnight report auditory hallucinations at rates approaching 60% after 6 months of employment. The combination of isolation, quiet, darkness, and the requirement to remain alert creates conditions nearly identical to sensory deprivation experiments. Guards report hearing voices, footsteps, doors opening, and other sounds that investigation reveals to be absent. Most guards recognize these as hallucinations, but report them as disturbing nonetheless. The job requirements: stay awake and alert in conditions designed to make the brain hallucinate, create inevitable perceptual distortions. The sounds aren't real, but the experience of hearing them is genuine. Fact 65. The snowstorm cocoon. Heavy snowfall creates acoustic isolation that has measurable psychological effects distinct from the visual effects of the storm. Snow absorbs sound so efficiently that the world beyond immediate vicinity becomes acoustically invisible. People report feelings of cocooning, disconnection, and unreality during heavy snow that correlate more strongly with acoustic isolation than with visual obscurement. The brain receives information that the world has contracted to the immediate surroundings. Nothing beyond 20 or 30 feet is acoustically present. This triggers both comfort responses, you're in a den-like protected space, and threat responses, you're cut off from escape routes and unaware of approaching dangers. The same condition creates contradictory emotional responses. Fact 66. The carpeted office depression. Heavily carpeted office environments create acoustic deadness that correlates with increased reports of depression and decreased energy among workers. Sound absorption by carpet, acoustic ceiling tiles, and cubicle walls creates an environment where sounds fall dead without the natural reverberance of normal spaces. Workers report feeling enervated, disconnected, and unmotivated. The mechanism appears to be related to the lack of acoustic feedback. Your voice, footsteps, and movements generate no environmental response. The space feels dead because acoustically, it is dead. The lack of sonic liveliness translates into psychological flatness. The environment literally dampens energy. Fact 67. The morning silence duration. Moments of silence for remembrance or mourning show optimal psychological impact at durations between 30 and 60 seconds. Shorter feels rushed and inadequate. Longer becomes uncomfortable and counterproductive. This duration appears to be cross-cultural and relates to the brain's processing of meaningful silence versus awkward silence. 30 seconds is enough for genuine reflection. Beyond 60 seconds, the silence becomes an endurance test rather than a commemoration. Event organizers across cultures have arrived at this duration independently, suggesting it's rooted in universal human psychology rather than cultural convention. The right amount of silence honors. Too much becomes about the silence itself. Fact 68. The server room tinnitus. Professionals working in server rooms with constant high-frequency fan noise show increased tinnitus rates compared to general populations. The particular frequency profile of server cooling fans, concentrated in higher frequencies around 4 to 8 kHz, overlaps with frequencies where age-related hearing loss first occurs. The combination of constant exposure and frequencies where the ear is already vulnerable creates conditions for accelerated hearing damage and tinnitus development. The rooms aren't quiet, but the steady-state noise creates a condition where professionals stop consciously hearing it, believing they've habituated, while the auditory system continues taking damage. The danger isn't the volume, it's the specific frequencies and duration of exposure. Fact 69. The empty stadium acoustic asterisk. Sports stadiums empty of crowds create vast acoustic spaces with unusual properties. The reverberance designed to contain and energize crowd noise becomes oppressive and strange when empty. Maintenance workers, security personnel, and athletes in empty stadiums report unease, with sounds echoing for seconds, creating a sense of vast emptiness that's psychologically oppressive. The spaces are designed for acoustic energy from thousands of people. Without that energy, they feel like acoustic voids that swallow sound and return it distorted. The empty stadium isn't just physically empty, it's acoustically wrong, a space designed for one acoustic environment forced to exist in another. Fact 70. The silence duration tolerance. Individual tolerance for silence varies measurably, with introverts tolerating approximately 40% longer periods of silence before experiencing discomfort compared to extroverts. Brain imaging suggests this relates to baseline arousal levels. Introverts have higher baseline activity in areas processing internal thoughts and lower need for external stimulation. Extroverts, with lower baseline internal stimulation, require more external input to maintain optimal arousal. Silence, for extroverts, represents understimulation that becomes uncomfortable more quickly. The preference isn't cultural or learned. It's neurological. What feels peaceful to one person feels understimulating or threatening to another based on brain structure differences. Fact 71. The acoustic glass barrier. High-quality soundproof glass creates visual connection with complete acoustic isolation in ways that generate documented psychological discomfort. You can see people talking, gesturing, experiencing sound, but you hear nothing. The resulting experience resembles certain types of dissociation or depersonalization disorders. You're separated from reality by an invisible barrier. Workers in soundproofed observation rooms, control rooms with glass overlooking production floors, or other acoustically isolated but visually connected spaces report feeling disconnected, unreal, or like they're watching life rather than participating in it. The acoustic isolation, despite visual connection, creates psychological separation more profound than solid walls would generate. Fact 72. The prayer silence physiology. Congregational silent prayer produces measurable synchronization of heart rates, breathing patterns, and even brainwave activity among participants. The shared intention to enter silence creates physiological coherence across individuals that wouldn't occur if the same people simply sat quietly without shared purpose. The mechanism appears to involve mirror neurons and unconscious social synchronization processes. The silence isn't just individual internal experience. It's a shared physiological state that develops through social coordination. This synchronization likely explains why communal silence feels qualitatively different from solitary silence. Your body is actually coordinating with others' bodies in measurable ways. Fact 73. The acoustic startle threshold. Quiet environments lower the threshold for acoustic startle response, the involuntary flinch and physiological reaction to sudden loud sounds. The quieter the baseline environment, the more dramatic the startle response to unexpected sounds. This isn't habituation failure. It's the nervous system maintaining constant threat sensitivity by adjusting startle threshold based on ambient conditions. In loud environments, the brain raises startle threshold to avoid constant false alarms. In quiet environments, it lowers threshold to catch any anomaly. The result is that quiet spaces make you more jumpy not through psychology, but through direct recalibration of reflexive response thresholds. The quiet doesn't just seem more fragile, it makes you functionally more sensitive. Fact 74. The wind tunnel silence. Wind tunnels and acoustic testing chambers create artificial silences that differ from natural quiet in ways that generate acute discomfort. The silence is too perfect. No variation, no subtle changes, no organic quality. The brain, receiving absolutely static acoustic input, has nothing to process, no changes to track. This creates a sensation described by research subjects as pressure or wrongness that builds over time. The silence isn't peaceful because it isn't natural. Living silence has subtle variation, the world breathing. Artificial silence is dead in ways the nervous system recognizes as fundamentally abnormal. You're not meant to exist in environments where nothing changes. Fact 75. The nighttime bathroom acoustic asterisk. Residential bathrooms at night create acoustic conditions that reliably trigger unease across cultures. Hard reflective surfaces, small enclosed space, and the particular reverberance of bathroom acoustics combine with vulnerability of being partially undressed and engaged in private activities. The acoustic environment amplifies every sound, breathing, water, your own movements, while simultaneously deadening sounds from outside the room, creating acoustic isolation. Evolutionary psychology suggests vulnerability during elimination would have been a period of heightened predation risk. Modern bathroom acoustics preserve the acoustic signature of that vulnerability. Cut off from help, unable to hear approach of threats, your own sounds amplified. Fact 76. The classroom silence types. Educational researchers distinguish between productive silence and punitive silence in classrooms, with measurably different physiological and psychological effects. Productive silence, students engaged in individual work, shows low cortisol, regular breathing, and relaxed muscle tension. Punitive silence, students forced into quiet as discipline, shows elevated cortisol, irregular breathing, and muscle tension. The acoustic environment is identical. The social context completely changes the physiological response. The body knows the difference between chosen silence and enforced silence, between quiet that serves your purposes and quiet that serves someone else's control over you. Fact 77. The distance silence distortion. Long-distance relationships conducted primarily through phone and video maintain less acoustic information than in-person relationships. The narrow frequency response of phone systems eliminates sonic information about environment, emotional state, and physical presence. Partners report increasing difficulty reading each other's emotional states, more frequent miscommunications, and a sense of unreality about the relationship. The lost acoustic information, room tone, breathing, small sounds of movement and presence, carried more relationship information than conscious communication. Removing it degrades relationship quality in ways that exceed the obvious challenges of physical distance. You're not just far apart, you're acoustically impoverished. Fact 78. The museum footstep consciousness asterisk. Art museums create acoustic environments where footsteps become hyperaudible through hard flooring and reverberant spaces. Visitors become acutely self-conscious about their footsteps, walking differently than they would outside, more carefully, sometimes on toes, often more slowly. This changed gait affects how art is viewed, creating a more hesitant, careful viewing style than the architecture alone would produce. The acoustic environment shapes behavior and experience. The museum is teaching you how to move through it not through rules but through acoustic feedback. You learn to walk quietly because every step announces itself. The space disciplines through sound. Fact 79. The night shift conversation asterisk. Workers on permanent night shifts develop different conversation patterns than day workers, with longer pauses, more silence, and lower verbal interaction rates. This isn't personality selection. The same workers assigned to night versus day shifts show the pattern. The combination of quiet nighttime environment, reduced staffing, and circadian disruption appears to make conversation more effortful. The silence between night shift workers isn't comfortable. It's the product of increased effort required for social interaction during hours the brain expects to be asleep in a quiet environment. The night shift isn't just work at different hours. It's work in an acoustic and neurological environment that makes social interaction more difficult. Fact 80. The airplane cabin pressure. Commercial aircraft cabins maintain noise levels around 85 decibels, just below the threshold for hearing damage, through engine sound, airflow, and pressurization systems. This constant noise creates acoustic masking that enables privacy in the packed cabin while simultaneously generating fatigue through chronic acoustic stress. Passengers report exhaustion after long flights that exceeds what would be expected from sitting still for equivalent time periods on the ground. The constant noise, not loud enough to be consciously disturbing, but constant enough to require the auditory system to work continuously to process and filter, generates measurable cognitive fatigue. The airplane isn't just physically exhausting. The acoustic environment is actively draining. Fact 81. The cooking show silence. Television cooking shows eliminate natural cooking silence through constant narration, music, and enhanced food sounds. When people attempt recipes from shows in home kitchens, they report the experience feeling wrong or lonely because actual cooking includes significant periods of silence, waiting for water to boil, ingredients to brown, timers to complete. The contrast between the acoustically dense television version and the actually quiet reality creates disappointment and disconnection. The expectation mismatch isn't about the food, it's about the acoustic environment. Cooking is actually quiet. Television taught you to expect otherwise. Fact 82. The dense fog acoustic asterisk. Dense fog affects sound propagation in complex ways, dampening some frequencies while creating unusual reflection patterns for others. People report difficulty judging distances, locating sound sources, and feeling oriented in heavy fog. The acoustic disorientation contributes to fog's psychological impact beyond the visual obscurement. Sounds seem closer or further than they are. Directions become ambiguous. The fog doesn't just hide. It distorts the acoustic information you use for spatial navigation. Maritime and aviation accidents in fog result partly from this acoustic distortion, not just visual impairment. The fog is lying to your ears as effectively as it's lying to your eyes. Fact 83. The headphone leak social. The social meaning of audible headphone leak, when other people can hear what you're listening to, varies by culture, but consistently creates social discomfort. The leak reveals private acoustic space to others while simultaneously polluting shared acoustic environment. Transit riders report irritation at headphone leak that exceeds objectively louder environmental sounds like engines or announcements. The violation isn't about volume, it's about the breakdown of acoustic privacy boundaries. The sound escaping headphones represents failed containment, audio that should be private made semi-public in a way that satisfies no one. It's too quiet to hear clearly and too loud to ignore. Fact 84. The pain silence asterisk. Patients in severe pain often become silent rather than vocal, contrary to cultural depictions of pain. Medical professionals identify this silence as a warning sign of critically severe pain. The mechanism appears to be conservation of energy. Vocalizing requires resources that severe pain makes unavailable. The silence of severe pain differs from comfortable silence or enforced silence. It's absence that communicates distress more effectively than sound would. Medical training specifically includes recognizing this silence, understanding that the quietest patients may be suffering most. The silence isn't stoicism. It's the body shutting down non-essential functions to cope with overwhelm. Fact 85. The study hall acoustics. University study halls show decreasing effectiveness with increasing acoustic isolation. Completely silent study spaces produce lower sustained concentration than spaces with low-level ambient sound. The mechanism appears related to the brain's need for acoustic variation to maintain alertness. Perfect silence allows mind wandering and drowsiness. Low ambient sound, pages turning, distant footsteps, muted voices, provides enough variation to maintain arousal without creating distraction. Modern library design increasingly incorporates this understanding, creating zones of different acoustic environments rather than enforcing uniform silence. The best study environment isn't the quietest. It's the one with the right amount of sound. Fact 86. The underwater quiet asterisk. Underwater environments create acoustic experiences completely unlike terrestrial quiet. Sound travels faster and further underwater, creating unusual propagation patterns. Divers report difficulty judging distances and directions of sounds. The absence of air conduction to the ear, sound reaches the inner ear through bone conduction, creates a quality of sound that the brain struggles to process normally. Extended underwater time creates temporary difficulties with normal hearing after surfacing. The auditory system has partially recalibrated to underwater acoustics and requires time to readjust. The underwater world isn't quiet. It's acoustically alien in ways that temporarily impair normal hearing function. Fact 87. The grief silence. Bereaved individuals show measurable changes in tolerance for silence and acoustic environment preferences. Recent grief correlates with preference for quiet environments, with tolerance for silence extending beyond normal ranges. Brain imaging suggests this relates to cognitive overload. Grief generates enough internal mental activity that external acoustic stimulation becomes overwhelming. The preference for quiet after loss isn't withdrawal, though it may resemble it socially. It's cognitive resource management. The brain is processing grief and has reduced capacity for processing external input. The silence provides space for internal work that dominates available processing resources. Fact 88. The ventilation hum health. Building ventilation systems produce constant low-frequency sounds that affect health in measurable ways when exposure exceeds 8 hours daily. Office workers in buildings with loud HVAC systems show increased stress hormones, blood pressure, and reported fatigue compared to workers in quieter buildings, even when conscious awareness doesn't register the sound as disturbing. The mechanism is chronic activation of the stress response. The sound isn't loud enough to demand conscious attention, but is variable enough that the auditory system can't fully habituate. The result is background activation of threat responses that accumulates over time. The building isn't just noisy, it's slowly stressing your physiology. Fact 89. The courtroom silence. Courtrooms create enforced silence that serves multiple functions: respect for proceedings, clarity for recording, and psychological control. The silence creates an acoustic environment where every word carries weight, where disruption is immediately obvious, where power dynamics become audible. Defendants, witnesses, and observers report the silence as oppressive, not peaceful. It's silence enforced by authority, silence that serves judgment. The acoustic environment reinforces the power structure. You remain quiet not from choice, but from institutional requirement. The silence communicates control as clearly as explicit rules would. Fact 90. The snowfall night difference. Snow falling at night creates different acoustic conditions than daytime snow. The absence of traffic and human activity combined with snow's sound absorption creates periods of almost absolute quiet in urban environments. City residents report finding this silence disturbing rather than peaceful. The acoustic environment doesn't match the visual environment. You can see a city, but you hear wilderness-level quiet. The mismatch creates cognitive dissonance. Your eyes tell you you're safe in populated areas. Your ears tell you you're isolated in empty space. The contradictory information generates unease. Fact 91. The phone silence meaning asterisk. Silence during phone conversations carries different social meaning than in-person silence. Phone silence lasting more than 3 seconds triggers anxiety in both parties, with the discomfort threshold significantly shorter than face-to-face conversation. The absence of visual cues means the silence can't be interpreted. You don't know if the other person is thinking, distracted, upset, or if the connection has failed. The ambiguity creates stress. Phone conversation requires more constant acoustic feedback than in-person conversation because it's the only information channel available. The silence might mean nothing, but you have no way to know that. Fact 92. The warehouse echo. Large warehouse spaces create echoes with delay times long enough to impair normal conversation. Workers in warehouses develop adaptation strategies, speaking more slowly, using shorter sentences, waiting for echoes to decay before continuing. New workers report difficulty understanding colleagues, not because of accents or vocabulary, but because the acoustic environment distorts normal speech patterns. The space makes conversation more effortful, leading to reduced verbal communication, more reliance on hand signals or written notes, and increased social isolation. The warehouse isn't just physically large. Its acoustic properties actively impair the communication that would normally mitigate isolation. Fact 93. The protest silence. Silent protests create psychological impact through violation of expectations. Protests are expected to be noisy. The silence becomes threatening to observers because it demonstrates discipline, coordination, and control. Governments consistently respond more strongly to silent protests than to equivalent noisy protests, suggesting the silence communicates danger more effectively than chants or shouts would. The mechanism appears to be that silence demonstrates restraint, and restraint implies the capacity for force currently being withheld. Noise is immediate release. Silence is potential energy. The quiet protest is scarier because it hasn't yet shown what it's capable of. Fact 94. The hotel room quiet asterisk. Hotel rooms in different properties have characteristic acoustic signatures that affect sleep quality more than mattress quality or room darkness. Sound isolation from corridors, HVAC noise profiles, and external noise all contribute to sleep architecture, the quality and depth of sleep cycles. Business travelers report greater sleep disruption from acoustic factors than from time zone changes in domestic travel. The room might look identical to your bedroom, but it sounds different, and that acoustic difference impairs sleep. Your brain monitors acoustic environment during sleep, and unfamiliar sounds, or unfamiliar silence, disrupt sleep cycles even when they don't cause full awakening. Fact 95. The acoustic surveillance. Modern surveillance doesn't require seeing. Acoustic monitoring provides equivalent information. The sounds of a household, conversations, footsteps, appliance use, plumbing, create patterns that reveal occupancy, activity, and routine. Smart home devices with constant microphone access normalize this acoustic surveillance, but the normalization doesn't eliminate the privacy erosion. Your acoustic footprint reveals when you're home, what rooms you use, how many people are present, and increasingly, through AI analysis, emotional states and relationship dynamics. The silence isn't silent anymore. It's filled with devices listening, categorizing, and reporting the sounds you make in supposedly private spaces. Fact 96. The altitude silence. High-altitude environments affect hearing and sound perception through reduced air density. Sounds propagate differently. The reduced oxygen affects neural processing, including auditory processing. Mountain climbers report difficulty with conversation, hearing distortions, and increasing preference for silence at extreme altitudes. The mechanism combines direct acoustic physics. Sound propagates differently in thin air, with neurological effects of hypoxia. The silence at altitude isn't just the absence of lowland sounds. It's an acoustically different environment processed by an oxygen-deprived brain. The hearing isn't failing. It's operating in conditions it wasn't designed for. Fact 97. The silence preference development. Children develop tolerance for silence gradually, with measurable milestones. Infants show distress in silence within seconds. Toddlers tolerate minutes. Adolescents develop adult-level silence tolerance. This isn't learning social rules, it's neurological development of the systems that allow comfortable solitude. Children who develop silence tolerance significantly earlier or later than typical ranges show correlation with other developmental measures. Suggesting silence tolerance is a marker of broader neurological maturation. The ability to be comfortable alone in quiet is literally a developmental achievement, not a personality preference. Fact 98. The interrogation silence weapon asterisk. Extended silence during interrogation constitutes recognized psychological pressure distinct from questioning. Interrogators use silence deliberately to create discomfort that increases compliance. The silence isn't absence of interrogation, it's active technique. Subjects report the silence as more stressful than questioning because it's ambiguous. The interrogator might be waiting for you to speak, considering charges, consulting with others, or simply applying pressure. The uncertainty combined with the inherent stress of enforced silence in a threatening context creates conditions where people speak to fill the void, often providing information they'd otherwise withhold. The silence isn't respite, it's a weapon. Fact 99. The concert silence after. The silence immediately after a concert or performance differs neurologically from pre-performance silence. The auditory system, adapted to high volume and intensity, perceives normal environmental sounds as quieter than they are, a temporary threshold shift. The brain is also processing the concluded performance, creating internal acoustic activity that competes with external sound for attention. Audiences report the post-concert silence as profound, almost oppressive, even when ambient noise levels are identical to pre-concert levels. The silence isn't deeper. Your hearing is temporarily recalibrated, and your brain is acoustically occupied with memory. Fact 100. The deathbed silence. The silence surrounding actively dying patients differs from other silences in measurable physiological effects on witnesses. Healthcare workers, family members, and others present for deaths show distinctive stress responses to the silence of dying. Elevated cortisol, changed breathing patterns, and activation of brain regions associated with threat and loss. The silence isn't just sad. It's biologically recognized as a significant event. The absence of sound from someone who should be making sound, the progression toward permanent silence. The nervous system recognizes dying through its acoustic signature, responding with stress responses that prepare for loss while simultaneously marking the significance of the transition occurring. The quiet places teach us what we already know but pretend to forget. We are animals who survived by listening, by reading the meaning in silence, by knowing that the absence of sound carries information as vital as sound itself. Every quiet place you felt uneasy in was telling you something true, not about ghosts or dangers that don't exist, but about the fundamental nature of human perception. We need sound to locate ourselves in space and time. We need acoustic variation to maintain consciousness and cognitive function. We need the sounds of others to feel connected and safe. Remove those sounds, and the architecture of human experience begins to destabilize in predictable, measurable ways. The silence isn't empty. It never was. It's full of your body's wisdom about survival, about threat, about the acoustic conditions under which human animals can and cannot thrive. Next time you feel unease in a quiet place, don't dismiss it. Listen to what the silence is telling you. Your ancestors did. That's why you're here to feel it.